Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weeb Union, and in this one, the Russians have made significant advances on the eastern section of the front line, on the western bank of the Cerberus River line in two different sections. There's been large advances by the Russians. Russians also advanced to the north of Toretsk and south of Kostiantynivka, with additional advances in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the western parts of the Zaporizhzhia region, and an advance in the Sumy region, while the Ukrainians made a counterattack and continued offensive operations towards recapturing a settlement on the western parts of the Sumy region, the town of Kostiantynivka. Starting out in the eastern section of the front line, the Russians made two large advances across the Cerberus River line, a spearhead push towards the flank of Novoplatonivka, where we see that the Russians and the Ukrainians have been fighting back and forth over Zaporizhzhia for quite a while. A lot of Russian shelling of the Ukrainian fortified positions to the east of the town as well. However, they have been unable to push through the defensive line of the Ukrainians. Now we see that the defensive line is clearly facing northwards with anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth ahead of the trenches that are situated just north of the town of Novoplatonivka. The Ukrainians also have some scattered fortified positions, trench networks around the eastern flank near Zaporizhzhia, Chernihiv, and Losova. The Russians took this opportunity for a push along these fortified positions, capturing one after another to the northern flank of Boryska, flanking the fortified line of the Ukrainians near Novoplatonivka. The objective of the Russians here is to completely cut off the supplies to the Ukrainian forces in the north, in the direction of Zaporizhzhia, Bohuslavka, and Novokrokhlyakivka, while at the same time also the fortified positions and gaining control over the defensive line and the town of Novoplatonivka, completely exposing the northern flank of Borova and the fortified positions associated with it to the north of the town. The Russian objective here is a ambitious spearhead on the eastern bank of the Usk River line to gain control of a vast area, encircling a vast amount of Ukrainian soldiers in numerous fortified positions and settlements. The Russian spearhead assault was confirmed with geolocated footage, and Deep State Map corroborated the extent of their push all the way to the northern flank of Borivska and Rivka. With this, the Russians are expanding their offensive operations on the western bank of the Cerberus River line, not just in the direction of Liman, but also along the Usk River line, where the objective of the Russians is to gain full control over the Usk River line from Kupiansk in the north all the way to Liman in the south. And this push is a major step in that direction, as it is, again, very ambitious. Gain control of several settlements in a single push like this can have significant advantages to the Russians if they succeed. However, if they fail, they'll be expending a lot of resources on it. The most difficult in such a situation is not to gain control over these fortified positions, but it is to hold them, especially with the Ukrainian positions in Chernihiv and Boryska and Rivka to the south, and the fortified positions on the northern flanks, which the Ukrainians can make use of to launch some counterattacks on the flanks of the Russian spearhead to cut it off from its route. It will be interesting to see over the next few days whether the Russians will expand their offensive operations further in the western direction, in the northern and southern flanks to secure the flanks, or if the Ukrainians will launch some counterattacks to cut off this Russian spearhead. If the Russians gain control over these settlements and fortified positions, they'll likely be able to flank the rest of these fortified positions to the southeast of the spearhead and Borova, gain control over which will completely secure the flank here near Stepi and Kupenki for offensive operations down south to connect with the forces in the Nova direction from the northern and southern flanks, launching offensive operations there. At the same time, Borova will be threatened directly. The Russians will be within firing range of their supply lines, cutting off the connections, the bridges across the Oska River line, and limiting the supplies within Borova will affect the larger frontline situation in this section. At the same time, the Russians also launch offensive operations, gaining control over Zelena Dolina, what remains of the town, as well as a vast area of forest lines to the northern flank of it, connecting their positions within Zelena Dolina with the ones near Karpivka, as they continue offensive operations along the river line towards Sereshna and Shentryholova. We see that the Russians are significantly expanding their offensive operations here across the Serbs River line following a few weeks of slow advances and Ukrainian counterattacks. Now that the Russians have completely secured the southern flank of Nove, they'll likely work on completely cutting off the Ukrainian push towards Ritkodub, gain control over the river line, and pushing into Hrushinkove and Novi Mir to secure those towns on the northern and western flanks, completely securing Nove as a supply hub for their forces pushing further south and north of this location. Further south in the direction of Toretsk, there were numerous advances by the Russians as well, both to the southwest and the northern flank of the city. In the northern flank, the Russians are fighting over the fortified positions on the western flank of Delivka, pushing in the direction of Oleksandru Shultine. The Russians are here fighting over both Bilaora and Oleksandru Shultine on the eastern flank of Kostiantynivka in their process towards connecting their forces in the Chasiv direction with the ones along the Toretsk direction, mainly pushing along the railways and forest lines in the area in an attempt to make use of the cover of the geographical advantages and then push into the Ukrainian settlements while shelling the Ukrainian reinforcements arriving to hold the lines and counterattack. The Russians secured the western flank of Toretsk, gaining full control over the western parts of the city. This leaves just a small part of the city in the gray zone, while the remaining parts is completely under Russian control. The Ukrainians do not have any foothold within the city any longer, which marks the official end of the Ukrainian Toretsk counterattack, which began right after the Russian capture of the city in January. With this, the fighting continues along the operationally encircled section of the front line west of the city, where the Russians are working on completely destroying the Ukrainian grouping of forces here within the settlements of Sherbinivka, Novospassky, Katerinivka, and Libenbyk, which marks two areas where the Russians are launching up ambitious operations: the Spearhead west of the Serbets River line and operational encirclement here west of Toretsk, which both would give the Russians a significant advantage over the Ukrainians in the local areas. Russians continued offensive operations in the direction of Yablonivka, flanking the town from the south with continuous advances to widen the front line, gaining access to additional supply routes into the town, and attacking it at the weak point where the streets here near Yablonivka is a single street that is very shallow, driving through from the eastern and western parts, while the positions in the north are being stormed by the Russian forces on the western flank, which leaves the southern flank exposed to the Russian offensive operations. The Russians are doing a combined strike from the southern and western flanks to spread out the front line and to widen the areas in which they can strike the Ukrainian forces at whenever a gap exposes their defensive weaknesses. The Russians are able to push through that, take advantage of it to gain control of additional fortified positions or footholds within the town, to gain control over Yablonivka, the western flank of the reservoir, and the southern flank of Kostiantynivka will allow the Russians to push into Stepanivka, Dovhabelka, and Roskishne on the western flank of Kostiantynivka, opening the road for Mykolaiv and the operational encirclement of the city from the southern flank. Further west, the Russians continued offensive operations in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region, where they managed to gain full control over Tolstoy and push in the direction of Reshkivsk, as well as Novokhatsk, where the Russians continued offensive operations on the southern bank of the Vovcha river line. The objective is to gain control over the river line, separating the Donetsk region with the Dnipropetrovsk region, gain control over these settlements and the river line, allowed Russians to have a strong northern flank for future offensive operations in the western direction, but have blown up the bridge cutting off the supply lines of the Ukrainians from the Dnipropetrovsk into the Donetsk region, and flanking the remaining fortified positions here along the main highway to the south of that, and the settlement of Oleksandrohad and Voskresenka from the north. The Russians also storming the town of Mirne from the northern direction, gaining control over the central parts and the northern parts of the town, pushing the Ukrainians out to the outskirts, while storming it from the flank as well. At the same time, the Russians continue offensive operations westwards towards Voskresenka, the eastern flank of the town, gaining control over some of these anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth lines prepared east of the town, while at the same time we also seeing the first offensive operations by the Russians here in the southwestern outskirts towards the Dnipropetrovsk region in the direction of the town of Meleivka. Russians are here working on getting control over the fortified positions and then push across the border area into the town, gain another foothold within the Dnipropetrovsk region. In the southern parts of the front line, the Zaporizhzhia region, Russians continued advances along the Dacha area, pushing into the town of Plevny, This is following them securing the fortified positions along the northern bank here in the direction of Kamyansk, where fighting continues to the outskirts of the town and within the Dacha area, where the Russians are taking advantage of the urbanized area, providing them with a lot of cover. The Russian infantry, once they enter the town, have to look out for drones and artillery, but other than that, they are mostly secure from Ukrainian long-range fire, especially when they enter into the basements where they can rest during the operations, build up their amount of infantry within the town, as well as building up some logistical positions, supply hubs for the forces to continue pushing along the river line. And this Dacha area actually continues all the way up to the next river line, to which another similar situation to the Kamyansk situation is present. The Ukrainians have several fortified positions, a defensive line, and a town split between the north and south. In the northern section of the front line, the Russians have also managed to make an additional crossing across the border between the Kursk and Sumy regions here near Gorenal, where they managed to gain control over some forest positions. I'll cross the border area. This is to widen the front line and gain control of additional parts here along the border area for the buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian positions, while the Ukrainians continue their counterattacks in the direction of Toretsk, where they managed to gain control over a western foothold here in the western parts of the town and additional parts in the northern parts of the town, while the central parts and eastern parts remain under Russian control. The Ukrainians are here looking to kick out the Russians from the town, push them out into the open field, from which they'll be exposed to Ukrainian artillery fire and FPV drones. To also open up the road for future counterattacks in the direction of Kostiantynivka and Kostiantynivka, as the Ukrainians are looking to pressure the Russian forces out of the Sumy region and re-enter the Kursk region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.